Dr. Mark Changizi here to Science Moment. What happened to flu? Where did flu go? And I wanted to talk about it from the perspective of someone who's more of a physics mathematician type of person, coming from sort of complex emergent systems, and what one sees when one is that kind of person and one sees these kinds of plots. Now, this was motivated in large part from seeing a piece that Martin Neal, John Engler, and Norman Fenton, these are sort of stats types of folks, really bright folks, and they've been talking about where did flu go, what happened to it, how did it just disappear, and they made an observation concerning the protocols at the CDC for diagnosing whether your patient has the flu. And I wanted to follow up on that. I think it can sort of take it to the next level. And let me now back up and talk about really what one sees when one sees the flu disappear as it did. So somewhere around April or so, mid-April, in many large parts of the world, and there was some suddenly the flu just disappeared. So in this graph that I'm showing, and you can find many other graphs with similar sudden stops, but we have Australia, who of course has their winter in the middle of the year, but nevertheless you can still see that there's some trace amounts of off-season flu going through there. But Sweden and the United States are fairly time-locked in terms of their peaks, but then suddenly all three, despite being on sort of the three different parts of the world, all suddenly in time-locked fashion crash and burn to zero. Many other parts of the world similarly crash to zero with similar time scales, but this is really enough to give you the overall kind of impression. And when one sees this, what one who's sort of a scientist of an sort of emergent complex systems type, what one sees is like, this is not biological in the sense of some force pushing something in some kind of linear fashion. This looks like complex dynamics. This looks like differential equations where suddenly something has gone above some threshold, and then suddenly, boom, something dies out. Let's say something goes, if it was the dynamics of some animals in some habitat, and suddenly you've gone over some threshold, and then boom, suddenly something's going to die out because there's too much predation upon it, or whatever it might be. You suddenly have the system just moving at an emergent level towards some kind of equilibrium where it completely goes away. Now, let's just run through some of the typical things that people have said, and just which I'm not going to get into, but some have said, oh, look how great masks are doing, that flu finally just disappeared all at once in completely different parts of the world, despite there not being mask mandates even at the time. So it just makes no sense whatsoever. It's a non-starter, and of course COVID was not slowed by masks whatsoever. Another is viral interference, which I don't know much about, but one of the issues with viral interference is that the time scales that are involved, even if there was some kind of viral interference, that once COVID starts to take hold, it slowly pushes out flu or other respiratory viruses. Well, that's the kind of thing that you could expect, but what you're going to see is not this kind of time-locked, sudden, worldwide, in different places all at once. That requires coordination in a way that the virus in one body and a virus in another body can't possibly coordinate in that fashion to make this kind of synchronicity happen. It's just the wrong kind of explanation. And it may have many other reasons why it's a bad explanation from sort of typical detailed virology to point out, but when you see this, there's just no way that this smells like that kind of phenomenon. What it smells like, again, is sort of complex emergent systems kind of effect. Now, I have a general kind of rule of thumb that I often talk about, and I've sort of been talking about it since 2020, which is my handy rule of thumb, which is that of all the COVID trends that you've seen, of the non-random variation, that is, a lot of the variation you see is just random stuff that has, is attributable to nothing, or just lots of just a gazillion different things. Of the non-random variation, 90% is due to artifacts. Just the way we test, the way we count, the way we report. There's so much that people that have dealt with data, and I'm a theorist in some sense, but no, my entire life I've published tremendous amounts of data and tremendous numbers of fields. When you deal with data, it's an entirely different world. Understanding data is understanding the world of artifacts and trying to get rid of them. Right? Most of the data that you see, you're seeing artifacts. You're not seeing reality. And the rule of thumb is, well, then the other 10% is due to habitat and biology, population resistance, density. There's going to be other things that explain a lot of this variability, why it's going up and down in different places. But almost 0%, effectively 0% for the rule of thumb, is due to intervention, the infection interventions that were placed, right? Lockdowns, masks, social distancing, and shutdowns, and so forth. Those explain none of the variation to first and second order. Right? So it's not the interventions that did this, and it doesn't even make sense for the interventions to have done these because, of course, they didn't work on COVID. How could they have worked uniformly like this in disparate parts of the world with radically different kinds of measures? It makes no sense as a non-starter. So what's brilliant about the observation of the CDC protocols for diagnosing whether your patient has flu this team pointed out is that it has all the seeds of collective hysteria inside it. The very way that the protocols have been designed for the diagnosis of flu both encourage collective hysteria, encourage consensus, as well as are susceptible to it. Right? So let's just go through this in detail. So now, think about yourself. You've got a hypothesis. Suppose you've got some thesis about something, and what do you want to do? You want to go get evidence for it. So you go find evidence, you go test something, you experiment something, you do something, and there's two possibilities. I have evidence backing my thesis, right? That's one possibility, or I have evidence against my thesis. It either comes out in my favor or against my favor. So if it comes out backing my thesis, well, that makes my thesis more probable. Well, that's good. It makes my thesis more probable. And if I have evidence against my thesis, well, then obviously that makes my thesis less probable. Let's just go through a little example, and this is going to be analogous to the way the CDC sets up its protocols for flu. And instead of it relying on a simple case as does the evidence support me or not, it's going to end up with two columns. And they're going to be this. It's going to be, the first one is, it's going to depend upon whether my thesis fits the consensus, or whether my thesis does not fit the consensus. Suppose that I have evidence backing my thesis, right? Well, then the first thing I have to ask is, well, does my thesis fit the consensus? Is it consistent with the consensus that's out there? And if that's the case, well, then if I found evidence consistent with my thesis and my thesis happens to agree with the consensus, well, then I'm right. Then we'll just conclude that I'm right. And I can even start applying and, doing my idea in practice, actually just implementing it, right? Because that's enough. It's already consistent with the consensus. So my amount of evidence just justifies me to conclude, yes, I'm right, let's do it. So if my evidence comes out against my thesis, well, then my evidence is probably wrong, right? I probably did the experiment wrong. It was probably a false negative because it disagrees with the consensus. So if I end up with evidence against my thesis, a thesis that's consistent with the consensus, well, my evidence was probably wrong, right? So that was the case of where I have a thesis and it happens to be fitting the consensus. In that case, well, if my evidence backs my thesis, well, then I'm right, right? Let's just start doing the idea. But if my evidence comes out against my thesis, well, probably my evidence is wrong because it's inconsistent with the consensus. So let's just presume that I'm wrong, right? You can see how this is pretty dangerous and absurd, absolutely absurd, but let's just follow it up. Now let's suppose that my thesis, the idea that I'm putting forth, actually is not that of the consensus, and suppose that I get evidence that backs my claim. Well, let's suppose that the rule is, well, no, if that were to happen, I'm wrong. My evidence is probably mistaken. I probably did the experiment wrong, and so I just need to presume that my thesis is wrong, and that the consensus, which is not my thesis, is right. And if I found evidence that was against my thesis, well, then my evidence is good because it means that my thesis is probably wrong, and it means that the consensus is right, which is, of course, not my thesis. So in this situation, you end up now, the way that you judge the evidence that I have for my thesis depends a lot on whether my thesis agrees with the consensus. Right? Now, so in the case of when my thesis fits the consensus, all of the pressures in some sense are pushing up towards it fitting into this sort of on diagonal case, this upper left. And when my thesis does not fit the consensus, then all the pressures push down. In both cases, they're pushing such that no matter what evidence I get, it's saying, well, probably your evidence is wrong, unless it agrees with the consensus, in which case then you're right. Right? That's all that this is doing. Now, this would be absurd. This would be crazy. So what this would do is that as you acquire evidence, then you're typically just continuing to be biased towards that of the consensus. And of course, that's just going to create a bigger consensus because, well, I've now got more evidence towards the consensus. And so, because you either get evidence for the consensus or any evidence that's not for the consensus is you're going to kind of discount, which means it's favoring the consensus. So once you have consensus favoring, you have a positive feedback, and consensus will then just suddenly, once it goes a little bit beyond one way or the other, 50%, it's going to suddenly go whoop, all the way to the end, something we've talked about before in terms of the dangers of the very notion of censoring non-consensus viewpoints or favoring consensus viewpoints means that you are almost guaranteed to get collective hysteria and groupthink. Right? And this entire stupid diagram that I just thought, if this is the way that we should do our epistemology, would lead to that. Right? Now, here's the problem. The CDC has effectively set up this as their very diagram or their very set of protocols for diagnosing whether somebody has flu. So let's just go through it a little bit here. Here are their two diagrams here. I'm going to, and in each case, on the very left half, we have the protocols for when flu viruses are circulating in the community. That is, it's already known that there's an epidemic of flu, that this flu is circulating. In some sense, that's the consensus in that case. And when you walk into this diagram on the left is, if the consensus is if everybody thinks that flu is being diagnosed everywhere, then do the following. Okay? And on the right-hand side, it says, here's what you should do if the consensus is that there's not flu circulating everywhere. Okay? So we're going to go in these more detail, but already you can see we've got 4 different things to do, and we have 2 cases. Each of them is how you're going to judge on the basis of your test of your patient whether or not they have flu is going to depend upon whether the community has been seeing or has the consensus to believe that flu is out there circulating. So let's go through this a little bit more slowly. All right, so this is just the earlier diagram. So now the axes are a little bit different. So before it was, I have evidence backing my thesis, I have evidence against my thesis. Well, now it's just going to be, I have evidence backing my thesis that my patient has flu, right? And I have evidence against my thesis that my patient has flu. So it's just same thing, evidence backing me or evidence against me, but it's the hypothesis or the thesis now concerns, does my patient have flu? And in the horizontal, on the vertical labels, instead of it just my thesis fits the consensus or my thesis does not fit the consensus, it's the consensus is that there's a flu pandemic or epidemic that is around, and my flu thesis, that is, I think that my patient has the flu, fits the consensus. And the next column is the consensus is that there's not a flu epidemic. And then my flu thesis, because this is still supposing that I have a thesis that my patient might have flu, does not then fit the consensus. So it's the same thing, the second sentence is here. My flu thesis fits or does not fit the consensus. What's changing is that on the left column, it concerns there being a consensus of a flu epidemic in the community, whereas on the right, the consensus is that there's not a flu epidemic, okay? But we have the same exact spaces in these diagrams as we had before. All right, so let's look at the top left first, and let's see what the CDC has to say about these. So here's the key parts of it. So if you get a positive test, and again, we're under the protocols of the consensus says that there's an epidemic of flu. There's flu in the community spread. It's already out there, right? So in that context, if you get a positive flu test, well, the interpretation is, okay, you got flu. Start doing antiviral treatments, right? So in that first upper left case, here's what we put. So you're right. Presume your patient has flu. Start treating with antivirals. All right. How about the bottom left case? In the bottom left case, well, this pulls up their diagram which is the red diagram, the negative test result that me, as the doctor who has this thesis that my patient has flu, but I got a negative test back. But this is in the context of the consensus being that there is community spread out there. So in this case, well, the interpretation is I've got a negative result, but you can't really rule out flu, especially if the test used is not high enough sensitivity, et cetera, et cetera. So they're saying, like, you really just can't rule it out. You pretty much have to assume that it's still flu. All right? You can use clinical signs and symptoms and medical history and physical examination and their activity and so forth to get more information. And you probably should just go ahead and initiate antiviral treatment as soon as possible if there's any suspicions that they might have complications and so forth. So pretty much act as if they probably have flu. Right? So in the bottom left, we end up with your evidence is probably mistaken. Just presume your patient has flu. Right? This is exactly what we saw before, right? As we're saying, so it's when it disagrees with the consensus, then it's pretty much the consensus. So now let's suppose in the other case. Now we're going to suppose that the consensus is that it's not a flu epidemic. So this is in the context of that there's no reason to believe, or the consensus believes that there's no epidemic at the moment. Okay? Well, what does the CDC have to say in this case? The CDC in this case, again, I'm the doctor, my thesis is that my patient may have flu, and I do a test and I get a positive result in this case. Now again, just remember, the positive test is going against the consensus because we're assuming here that there's no community spread at the moment. So the consensus is like, no, there's no flu in the community. So I have a thesis that's going against the consensus despite my positive result. So what does it say? It says, well, flu infection is possible if there's an epidemiological link to an influenza outbreak, which of course we're already assuming it's not. So it's not that, because that's why we're in this very category in the right column. Consider that it might be a false positive, right? Consider that it might be a false positive. To the extent that they kind of are saying that you might maybe have it, it's only if you can connect it to another epidemiological spread someplace that maybe they were traveling, right? So in this case, and in the actions of what they should do, there's no recommendation to do viral treatment. So here, in this top right corner, your evidence is probably mistaken. You're probably wrong about that evidence. Presume your patient does not have flu. Don't do antiviral treatment. Presume that you're wrong and that the consensus that there's not flu in the community is true. And finally, the bottom right, so this is what they say when, again, there's no flu in the community. I've got a negative test, which is agreeing with that. It's against my thesis that my patient might have flu. So in this case, it says, well, a flu infection is unlikely. A flu infection is unlikely, basically, in this case. It's not suggesting to do antiviral treatments unless there's suspicion that the patient is very high risk or has progressive disease, some very, very rare circumstances. But already, even when there was a positive test for flu, you saw just a second ago, they didn't recommend doing antiviral. So this is even less reason, right? So once someone says, yeah, they don't want me to do anything, even if I have a positive test, if there's no epidemic in the community, so why would they expect me to actually do anything about it when I have a negative test, agreeing with the consensus, right? So overall, we end up with a case like we saw before. And when I have evidence against the consensus, it pushes me back towards the consensus position. We have the exact same social forces. These are social forces because they're depending upon the opinions of other people in the community, right? So in the case of flu, right, suddenly, which was a strange situation, when COVID happened, suddenly there was all this talk about, oh my God, there's COVID floating around. We have these reasons to believe the COVID is floating around. And so as soon as there was enough people saying, well, maybe there's COVID and not flu floating around, then suddenly there was consensus that it wasn't flu floating around, right? By mid-April, because COVID was supposedly floating around, maybe February, March at the time was the conversation. So it then became clear by mid-April that, okay, Flu is not floating around anymore because there's this other thing that's floating around, which makes the consensus this right-hand column here. That's the consensus. The consensus is that there's no flu epidemic anymore. So, well, if you get a negative test on flu, well, then of course it means there's no flu. But even if you get a positive test for flu, it pushes you to say, well, still probably not flu, because it's against the consensus. So it again pushes you down away from flu. And what does that do? If you are concluding it's not flu and not reporting that it's flu, well, and ending up probably then diagnosing it as COVID, it means there's even stronger consensus that it's not flu, which makes others even more likely. That arrow pointing downward gets stronger. And it gets stronger and stronger and stronger until by mid-April, whatever it was in the earlier graph, and boom, there is no more flu. And this happens not at the scale of the way that viruses interact with one another, right? It happens at the scales that humans interact with one another and communicate by email and social media and journalists and all of these talkings that they do to one another. It happens at those scales, and it's only at those kinds of social scales, socio-political scales, that you can find the kind of synchronicity and speed and alacrity of the way that flu suddenly disappeared, as it did worldwide. It's because the CDC, baked in the very protocols of the CDC's way to diagnose whether a patient has flu, it is inherently susceptible to collective hysteria. It inherently encourages it. It is ripe for groupthink, and that is what occurred, right? This is what occurred. This explains, it has all of the hallmarks, all of the smell of groupthink and emergent systems of it suddenly sliding to the side and going to a different state. That's what we can see. And here is why. This is why. This is why. It's because of favoring the consensus, which led to small differences from equilibrium to go unstable equilibrium, pushing all the way to the end. Flu did not disappear. It could have been there was some viral interference, and there was some different parts of the world may have gone down, and some changes in some relative numbers of these things. But flu did not suddenly disappear. And if flu didn't suddenly disappear, then why was the world threatened with being fired and banished? Not just threatened, actually fired and banished if they didn't take another particular kind of medication, right? Why did that happen? All right, so the entire notion of which virus was even spreading has been completely and systematically misunderstood by virtue of emergent collective hysteria sorts of forces. And the seeds of that have been sitting in the CDC's very protocols the entire time. Right? And that was your science moment. If you're interested in understanding these kinds of psycho-societal emergent level forces, this is what I focus on at loofwired.com. Just LOOF, like being aloof, but just loofwired.com. This new science magazine, which sort of defends freedom and understanding decentralization of the complex processes. It's sort of the magazine that's associated with my Free Expression Institute, freex.group. And get yourself a copy of Dr. Tim Barber and my most recent book on the origins of emotional expressions and the foundations of free expression itself. And that was your science moment.